Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book On Guard by William Lane Craig. In this video, we will have a look at Chapter 8 of the book, which is titled, Who Was Jesus? So let's get started. Craig begins his discussion of Jesus by stressing that understanding context is essential for understanding a given event. Therefore, the life, miracles, and resurrection of Jesus must be discussed in their proper historical context. I agree. What a nice note to begin the chapter on, a note of rare agreement between myself and William Lane Craig, or Bill, as I like to call him. Of course, I would say that whatever else that context might include, it should at least include the fact that Jesus lived in the same world as the rest of us, a world where miracles are often claimed but to date never substantiated, and where dead people have a very strong tendency to stay dead. This is not the context in which Craig wants to discuss Jesus, however. It was nice while it lasted. According to Craig, the proper context for understanding Jesus, particularly the resurrection of Jesus, is the unparalleled life and claims, and that is a quote from Craig, of Jesus. And this is because the resurrection is best understood as the climax to the life and ministry of Jesus. And this is an example of an apologist trope that we've seen many, many times throughout the various An Atheist Reads series that I've done, inflating the significance of Jesus. Obviously, Jesus would be an important figure to Christians. But apologists such as Craig like to insist that Jesus is of unmatched significance to everyone, regardless of their beliefs or of how credible they find the Christian claims about Jesus to be. Craig wants to prime the pump, or in a less charitable phrasing, stack the deck, to prepare for his pro-Jesus arguments by establishing from the very beginning, before he has even made a single claim about Jesus, that the life of Jesus was of singular importance. So he writes of the unparalleled life and claims of Jesus before he even begins to get into his case, to just sort of set the table, to imply that, well, we can all agree before we start that the life of Jesus was of unparalleled significance and importance. Really? Yeah, okay, I guess. Just for the sake of argument, let's say we can. The bit about the claims of Jesus has long struck me as odd, and this is something that Craig will devote much of this chapter to discussing, the claims that Jesus makes about himself that we see in the New Testament. Again, from the Christian perspective, it makes sense to view the life of Jesus as extraordinary, and if the Christian view of Jesus represented reality, it would certainly be fair to describe his life as extraordinary. But his claims about himself, while they are certainly unusual, assuming the words of Jesus depicted in the New Testament are historically accurate, they're hardly paralleled. And Craig is saying that not only was Jesus' life singular and unique and extraordinary, but his claims about himself were unique and unparalleled and extraordinary and unprecedented in history. The ministry of Jesus and the following it attracted may have been one of a relative few to last beyond the lives of its founding members, but Jesus was far from the only person to ever claim he was God, or a child of God, or capable of working miracles, or gifted with special knowledge or divine authority. Apologists try to frame Jesus claiming to be the Son of God as a unique and revolutionary claim by pointing out that no other founder of a religion claimed to be a child of God or God in the flesh. And that might be true of major world religions that have existed for thousands of years, but there are plenty of smaller cults that never quite caught on, which were founded by people who made exactly those sorts of claims. Jesus was certainly not the last person to do so, and I tend to doubt that he was the first. If I may speak for a moment in the parlance of a pro wrestling fan, Jesus didn't invent the gimmick, he just got it over. Jesus himself didn't leave behind any writings, Craig acknowledges, but this doesn't mean we can't know anything about him. It's not even that unusual for an ancient figure. For example, Socrates didn't leave behind any writings either, at least none that survived to our present day. We know about Socrates and his life and his teachings thanks to the writings of others who knew Socrates or knew about him. Primarily, Plato is the major source for Socrates. His works did survive. Craig says, quote, "But while this situation isn't unusual, it does raise the question, how do we know that these records are accurate? Maybe Jesus' followers said that he said and did certain things that he really didn't. Maybe the historical Jesus who really lived was very different from the divine figure we read about in the Gospels. How can we tell if these records are historically accurate?" This is a very good question, and it's a question I often ask myself. I am very willing to concede that there was probably a historical Jesus. I am not a committed mythicist when it comes to the existence of Jesus. I accept the mainstream scholarly consensus that there probably was a historical Jesus. But can we know very much about him for certain with a great deal of confidence? No, probably not. And I tend to think that he was probably different from the Jesus we read about in the New Testament in some very significant ways. But Craig says that we can figure out how historically reliable the Gospels are, the New Testament documents are, through textual criticism and history. And textual criticism is a powerful and useful tool, no question. It can tell us a lot about texts such as the Bible, whose origins and histories we might not otherwise be able to know. But textual criticism, particularly when paired with a study of history, doesn't vindicate Craig's Christian interpretation of the New Testament and Jesus. In fact, it's very much the opposite. Craig's presentation begins taking a misleading course very early on here when he boasts of the number of ancient sources outside the New Testament that refer to Jesus. Again, this is a very popular apologist talking point. Craig says that it is quite extraordinary for a figure as obscure as Jesus to have so many extra biblical sources that refer to him and testify to his existence. And in doing this, I think Craig is trying to have it both ways regarding the obscurity of Jesus. On the one hand, he's using the fact that such a modest, simple preacher and carpenter as Jesus became such a well-known figure. And this, Craig is seeming to think, implies that, well, Jesus must truly have been an extraordinary person because he wasn't a head of state, he wasn't a military general, he was just a simple carpenter and an itinerant preacher, and yet he was referenced by all of these great historians decades after his life was over. So he must have done some pretty impressive things. But on the other hand, Craig is also claiming that Jesus was God incarnate who performed miracles that were witnessed by crowds numbering in the hundreds to the thousands and whose resurrection from the dead was apparently a fairly well-known event at the time. Why would any such figure ever be described as obscure in the first place? And in fact, if Jesus truly did all of those things in front of so many witnesses, and if his feats and his miracles and his resurrection were so well attested and well known in the area at the time, we would expect, I would think, to find even more references to him than we find. Wouldn't you think? The guy who worked miracles and returned from the dead after being publicly executed, that seems like a pretty big deal. That seems like a handful of references in a few sources from a century or so later would actually not be that big of a deal. If he wasn't actually an itinerant preacher, but a demigod and a miracle worker, we would expect him to be well known enough to be referenced in at least a few sources. And that leads into the other problem with how Craig describes the extra biblical references to Jesus. He says it's remarkable that a person as obscure as Jesus would be referenced so often by writers beyond the New Testament, but he's ignoring the fact that all of those ancient extra-biblical references date to decades or in some cases centuries after the events depicted in the Gospels supposedly took place, by which time Jesus was fairly well known in his region of the world thanks to his followers. Christians were a well-known group or a well-known cult throughout the Roman Empire in that region, and a lot of people probably knew who Jesus was because of the activities of his followers. Knowing that, it makes sense that most of the extra-biblical references to Jesus refer simply to his existence or to the beliefs of his followers. The extra biblical references don't treat the miracles and resurrection and divinity of Jesus as matters of fact. Craig and the other apologists who cite the extra biblical sources for Jesus ignore that, but to me, it's significant. If the gospel accounts of Jesus are historically accurate, and he was truly God incarnate who worked miracles and returned from the dead, why is it none of those characteristics are confirmed by sources outside the New Testament? Why is it the sources beyond the Bible say, at most, there was a guy named Jesus and he had a following of believers and they believed that he worked miracles and returned from the dead, and there is not a single source from outside the Bible from roughly around the time that Jesus lived or the period immediately following his life that says Jesus was a person who actually did work miracles and return from the dead, and this was a well-known thing that happened. Where's that source outside of the New Testament? Craig calls the New Testament documents the most important historical sources about Jesus, and says that references to Jesus outside the New Testament don't tell us anything new about him, but only confirm what we read in the Gospels. That's not true. The outside sources don't confirm that Jesus was God incarnate, or that he worked miracles, or that he returned from the dead. At most, they confirm that his followers believed those things, not that those things were factual. It is simply not true, or at least it is very misleading, the way Craig says the outside sources confirm what we see in the New Testament. They confirm some of it, yes. They confirm the existence of Jesus. They confirm the beliefs of Jesus's followers. They do not confirm the facts of Jesus's miracles or resurrection or godhood. That's simply not true. Why are the New Testament documents the most important sources for Jesus? Again, from a Christian perspective, that makes sense. Obviously, those would be the most important sources for Jesus to a Christian. But why should non-Christians agree with Craig's assertion? Because the New Testament contains more biographical detail than the other sources? But if the biography of Jesus found in the New Testament can't be substantiated and is suspect due to the extraordinary claims it makes about the nature and abilities of Jesus, what does it matter how much detail there is? If you have two documents about the life of George Washington, and one is a few paragraphs on a single page, and the other consists of 4 volumes and thousands of words, it might seem obvious that the second document is the more important one. But what if it turns out that the information contained in the single-page document is more or less reliable, while the 4-volume document consists mainly of outlandish claims that can't be substantiated by any other source, and also bears signs of having been tampered with by someone other than the original author, and also displays a marked bias in favor of one particular, somewhat worshipful interpretation and view of Washington? In that case, which document would you say is the most important? I mean, if you care about accuracy and facts and history, even though it's a little slight, I think you would have to say that that single page with the mostly correct, reliable information would be the more important document. Craig doesn't offer any reason for the New Testament being more important than other sources for Jesus, other than the amount of information about Jesus they contain. But if that information can't be trusted to be historically reliable, I don't really see how it's sensible to treat the New Testament as any more important than any other source. Amusingly, Craig then argues that focusing on the New Testament is not an example of circular reasoning, because historians don't use the New Testament to prove itself. Instead, they study it to determine if it's historically reliable. But in declaring it to be the most important source for Jesus, Craig is performing something like circular reasoning himself, treating the New Testament as the most important source due to the amount of information it contains about Jesus, while ignoring the fact that nearly all of it is unsubstantiated, including the most extraordinary and therefore dubious, but to Christians most important, details. Those details being the ones that pertain to the miracles and godhood and resurrection of Jesus. Completely unsubstantiated. The only reason to trust the New Testament as a historically reliable source, uncritically, credulously, as Craig seems to be recommending that we do, is if you simply trust that it's true. You treat it as a self-verifying source, and that, I'm afraid, is circular logic. Craig criticizes modern, what he calls radical reconstructions of the historical Jesus for relying on writings from outside the New Testament, which originated later and were probably forgeries, pretending to have been written by apostles such as Thomas or Peter when they were actually written in the 2nd century. And I agree with Craig that it would be foolish to try and historically reconstruct the life of Jesus using unsubstantiated documents that were written decades or even centuries after the life of Jesus by people who didn't know him or weren't present or even alive during the events in question, but were pretending to be, were writing in the name of someone who was. I agree with him that that's a big problem. The problem for Craig is the Gospels themselves also fall into that category. They were titled for people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who didn't actually write them. We have no idea who actually wrote them. They claim to have been written by people who knew Jesus and witnessed the events, or at least by people who talked to people who were witnesses to Jesus, but that's almost certainly not true. The fact that people who try to base a historical view of Jesus on the non-canonical Gospels are wrong doesn't mean that Craig, who bases his historical view on the canonical Gospels, is right, or that his very credulous interpretation and method of reading the Gospels is correct or sensible. I don't think it is. Craig challenges the skeptical assumption that the Gospels should be assumed to be unreliable until proven reliable. He argues that we should do just the opposite, assume the Gospels are reliable until we have evidence proving otherwise. Craig lists 5 reasons why he thinks it's unreasonable to be so skeptical of the reliability of the Gospels. Those 5 reasons are that there was insufficient time for legendary influences to erase the core historical facts, that the Gospels are not analogous to folk tales or urban legends, that the Jewish transmission of oral traditions was highly reliable, that the presence of eyewitnesses restrained the embellishment of traditions about Jesus, and that the Gospel writers have a proven track record of historical reliability. So let's take these one at a time. The first one is a golden oldie of apologetics and a personal favorite of Craig's. He's one of the people that really popularized this argument, that not enough time passed from the life of Jesus to the writing down of the Gospels for them to have been contaminated significantly with legend and embellishment. And Craig cites the historian A.N. Sherwin White, as have many other apologists who want to convince their readers that at least 2 generations must have come and gone since the original events for legends to have grown up around them. That is the principle that Craig and many other apologists who have taken up this argument rely on. They say that A.N. Sherwin White, the noted historian, said that you need 2 generations to have passed between the occurrence of the events and the writing down of the events in order for there to be historical contamination and distortion. And the problem is, the book of Sherwin White's that Craig and others cite when making this argument, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament, takes no definitive position on the historicity of the Gospels, considers the subject of historicity only briefly, and during that consideration states that he does not consider the Gospels to be any more distorted than other comparable sources, which is a far cry from affirming them as factual. In fact, he compares the New Testament to other sources which he describes as deplorable. And while Sherwin White writes that the historical Christ is knowable in his opinion, he also stresses that sources like the New Testament must be read critically in order to extract any historical information they might contain. And most importantly for this discussion, Sherwin White does not propose any kind of universally applicable principle that states that stories about historical events must have originated at least 2 generations after the events took place before we can start to assume that they contain legendary or embellished elements. What he actually says is a deal of distortion can affect a story that is given literary form a generation or 2 after the events. And that is an exact quote from his book. He does not say that 2 generations must pass between the events and when they are written down before we can assume the accounts about them have been distorted. For a more detailed treatment of Sherwin White and how apologists have dishonestly cited his work for their own purposes, I recommend the article The Apologist's Abuse of A.N. Sherwin White by Vince Hart, which you can read at his blog and which is linked in the description of this video. And I highly, highly recommend that because it goes into a lot more detail than I have time to go into here about how Craig and others distort the claims of Sherwin White that are found in his book. Now, finally, even if Craig's own stated understanding of Sherwin White's work is to be trusted, and it isn't, it still doesn't do what Craig wants it to do. Listen to what Craig says, quote, "According to Sherwin White, the writings of Herodotus enable us to determine the rate at which legend accumulates, and the tests show that even 2 generations is too short a time span to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hard core of historical facts." Now look carefully at what Craig says there. 2 generations is too short a time to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the core of historical facts. Very few people would argue that the Gospels are 100% ahistorical. Most historians and scholars, even very skeptical ones, would agree that there is a foundation of historical fact in the Gospels, and that part of that foundation is that some form of a historical Jesus existed. There was some historical basis for the Jesus we read about in the Gospels. And if you read the Gospels critically, as Sherwin White advises, in other words, if you do the opposite of what Craig wants you to do, you can identify the historical facts that are there beneath the legends and distortions, or you can identify which bits you can be maybe more confident that they are historical than not. Craig's assertion that the Gospels originated too soon to have been distorted is obvious horseshit, and I will give you a good example of why I think that's true in a minute. But the main point is, it's certainly possible and even probable that the Gospels do contain a core of historical fact about Jesus. But Craig is assuming that that core of historical fact includes the miracles and godhood and resurrection of Jesus. And it probably doesn't. The historical facts that are at the core of the gospel story that have been layered over with legend and embellishment and exaggeration and idolization is probably the basic stuff. The where, the when, the who, the fact that Jesus existed, the fact that he was a preacher, certain biographical details that aren't historically in dispute. That's probably the core of history that is there, not the miracles. Not the resurrection, not the incredible stuff, the basic mundane stuff, the stuff that most people probably wouldn't waste their time arguing with Craig about. But Craig wants to say there's a historical core of truth to the Gospels, which to him means they're all true. Or at least we should assume that every claim the Gospels make is true going in. That is not at all what Sherwin White says, and even if he stated a principle as Craig says he did, that still doesn't say what Craig thinks it says. Next, Craig says that the Gospels aren't like folk tales, because folk tales aren't about real historical figures. Whereas the Gospels are about Jesus, who was a real person who actually lived, and the Gospels also contain accounts of other people who we know, or at least have reason to believe, were real historical figures, like Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas, John the Baptist, etc., etc. And again, this is horseshit, this claim that folktales don't depict real people, and I will have an example of why I think this is horseshit forthcoming in just a minute. The reliability of Jewish oral traditions is irrelevant. If the traditions were false to begin with, or legendary to begin with, the fact that the Gospels were passed down and copied more or less accurately from one generation to the next is nice. Says a lot about the Jewish oral tradition and then the written tradition that picked that up. It's good for the people who pass those traditions down, but it doesn't mean that those traditions are historically reliable. The presence of eyewitnesses restraining embellishment is also horseshit. and so is the supposed historical reliability of the gospel writers. We have no idea who the gospel writers actually were. The only writer Craig spends any time examining in terms of historical reliability in this chapter is the author of Luke and Acts, and Craig's only source for the historical reliability of the author of Luke is, wait for it, the author of Luke himself, who says in the introduction of the Gospel of Luke that he means to write an orderly account that contains the truth. Sorry, I don't think it's reasonable to believe in miracles and resurrections just because one of the anonymous, unaccountable people who reported that they happened said that he really tried to get it right. So, here's the example that I mentioned that demonstrates how foolish several of Craig's arguments here are. It's an example that I've referenced in at least one previous An Atheist Reads series, and I think it's been a few years since I brought up this example, so hopefully if you remember the last time I talked about it, it won't be too repetitive because it's been a while. So, my example is the book The Life of George Washington by Parson Weems. And this book is one of the most famous, if not still the most famous biography of George Washington. And it was the first major biography ever published about George Washington. And it is the source for some of the most famous and enduring stories about George Washington, including the story that as a child he chopped down a cherry tree and then admitted to it when his father questioned about it. And Washington, of course, said to his father, "I cannot tell a lie." The book was first published in 1800, the year after Washington's death. And the cherry tree story was actually added in a later edition that I believe was published in 1805, maybe 1809. Regardless, it was within several years of the first publication date and well within Washington's generation. So many of Washington's contemporaries and witnesses to his life were still around, but despite their presence, despite the presence of people who knew that much of what was contained in the book was false or exaggerated or biased or skewed in some way, despite their presence, despite the fact that George Washington was a real person and not an imaginary folk hero, the book is not a terribly reliable history of George Washington. And yet, it was accepted as such by many people. Much of the book is apocryphal, including the cherry tree story, and yet it was incredibly popular. Generations of Americans have grown up believing the cherry tree story. And from even stories about Washington that don't originate in that book. For instance, the story that Washington once threw a silver dollar across the Potomac River, or perhaps across the Rappahannock River. It depends on who's telling the story. Almost certainly did not happen, but it is told as a part of the legend of Washington, and people assume that it really happened. It is a folk story, and yet it is about a real person, a historical figure that we know existed, and many people treat it as though it is true and believe that it is true. Parson Weems' book is not completely lacking in facts. It's online. It's public domain. You can read it if you want. It's kind of an entertaining book. I wouldn't treat it as a reliable history, but it's certainly not without literary value. If you like florid, exaggerated, early 19th century American literature, it doesn't get everything wrong. It gets a lot of the facts about George Washington's life correct. There was a man named George Washington. He did exist. He did work as a surveyor. He was a general during the American Revolution. He did become the first president of the United States. Weems, like the author of Luke, claimed to be writing in order to record the truth about his subject, but his actual purpose seems to have been not biography, but hagiography. And they are not the same thing. It's not that hagiographies don't contain any historical facts, they often do. But they must be read critically, not credulously, if we want to glean reliable history from them. And it must also be understood that the presence of some authentic historical fact does not validate the entire document. Just because Weems got Washington's place of birth right doesn't mean that Washington actually chopped down that cherry tree. Just because Pontius Pilate was a real person and Jerusalem was a real place doesn't mean Jesus was actually the Son of God, worked miracles, and rose from the dead. Well, Craig attempts to demonstrate the historical authenticity of 3 claims that Jesus makes about himself in the Gospels. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Craig puts a lot of stock in the claims that Jesus makes about himself. First, there is Jesus' claim that he is the Messiah, which he doesn't explicitly make. He never comes out and says in any of the Gospels, "I am the Messiah." But we can infer that he thought he was the Messiah from passages such as Mark 8:27 through 30, when Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do people say I am?" And they go through the different nicknames that people have given him. And then finally Peter says, "They say you are the Christ," or "They say you are the Messiah." Also, Jesus' claim to be the Messiah was the justification for his execution by the Romans, since the Jewish authorities who opposed Jesus represented his claim to be the Messiah or the King of the Jews as treasonous against Rome, and that was Rome's excuse for executing him. How does Craig demonstrate that any of this is historically authentic? He doesn't. He refers to independent sources, which established that the plaque nailed over the head of Jesus on the cross read King of the Jews, but the only specific sources he cites are the Gospels of Mark and John. Those apparently are what he means by independent sources that confirm that not only did Jesus claim he was the Messiah, but that was the reason he was executed. In other words, Craig's version of reading the Gospels critically is to assume everything they say is reliable from the start, and since the Gospels depict Jesus acting like he was the Messiah, allowing his followers to believe he was the Messiah and being executed for claiming he was the Messiah, then it should be considered historically authentic that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. Okay. Next, there's the claim that Jesus was the Son of God. Jesus made this claim about himself in several passages of the Gospels, including explicitly in Matthew 11:27, which reads, "All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son." The Father is God, the Son is Jesus. Just as with the claim to be the Messiah, Craig argues that the Gospels depicting Jesus claiming to be the Son of God should be enough evidence for us to conclude that Jesus actually historically claimed to be the Son of God. And finally, Jesus claimed the title of Son of Man. This is Jesus' favorite nickname for himself. He calls himself the Son of Man frequently throughout the Gospels, and this title, Craig says, refers not only to the humanity of Jesus, as in he was a son of man, but also to the figure who appears in a vision described in the book of Daniel, who is described as looking like a son of man, but he was this supernatural figure that Daniel had a vision of. And by calling himself the Son of Man, Jesus is claiming to be that person whose coming was foretold by Daniel, the one to whom was given everlasting dominion, so that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. Let it never be said that Jesus was all that modest. That's one of the interesting inconsistencies. You know, a lot of Christians talk about how much they love Jesus because he was so meek and mild and humble and modest, and then you actually read the Gospels and you see him making these outlandish claims about himself, not only being the Son of God, but being the Son of God who was given everlasting dominion so that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. Okay. That's just humble Jesus. He's just a humble, modest, easygoing, unassuming type of guy who wants you to know that he was sent to rule the world. Lather, rinse, repeat. Craig argues that Jesus actually said the thing he says in the Bible because the Bible depicts him saying it, and we have no reason not to trust the Bible. Craig spends the rest of the chapter going over other claims that Jesus makes about himself in the Gospels, implicit claims such as that he held the authority of God, that he had the power to cast out demons, that he had the power to forgive sins and to work miracles, that he was to be a judge over humanity. These are things that he never comes right out and says, but we can infer from his actions or from his words. And what is the point of all of this? Why have we been talking all this time about the claims of Jesus and whether or not the claims are historically accurate? Quote, here is a man who thought of himself as the promised Messiah, God's only Son, Daniel's Son of Man, to whom all dominion and authority would be given, who claimed to act and speak with divine authority, who held himself to be a worker of miracles, and who believed that people's eternal destiny hinged on whether or not they believed in him. Today, there is virtually a consensus that Jesus came on the scene with an unheard of authority, namely with the authority of God, with the claim of the authority to stand in God's place. In other words, Jesus really believed he was the Son of God and that he acted with God's authority. And I feel like I'm waiting for another shoe to drop. I'm not trying to be a dick, but Craig spent an entire chapter, or a good chunk of a chapter, trying to establish the historicity of the Gospels. And having, he thinks, established that, his big point is that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God and really seemed to believe it. And I should believe it. Why exactly? This, again, is one of those common arguments that apologists trot out over and over, and they present it with a lot of confidence, as though it's just a home run for them. Craig does this, Lee Strobel does this, Josh McDowell does this, all the big apologists of the last 20 or 30 years. They all show up loaded for bear, and they throw themselves into this very powerfully argued, passionately presented claim about how Jesus was really full of himself. This guy really believed he was the Son of God. He spoke like he had God's authority. These people had never seen anyone like him. Even if I grant Craig his point that a historical Jesus really did see himself in this way, what is this supposed to prove? Is the fact that a real Jesus really thought he was the Son of God supposed to make me believe it? For all I know, John Edward really believes he's talking to the spirits of dead people. Does that mean I should believe it? I know there's no such thing as a psychic, but when this guy says he is one, he seems like he really means it, so I don't know. Maybe he really is one. He must be. He really seems to believe he is. The fact that Jesus really believed those things about himself, according to Craig, is what led to his arrest, his trial, and his execution. But the really important thing, Craig says, is what happened after his arrest and trial and execution. According to the Gospels, Jesus really thought he was the Son of God, so that means that the Gospels are accurate when they say he came back from the dead, right? I guess that is something that we will explore in the next video, because that's the end of this chapter. The next video will deal with chapter 9 of the book. Did Jesus rise from the dead? I suppose we could just skip to the end and say, if we read the Bible the way Craig says we should, which is to just credulously accept every single claim that it makes, then yeah, of course Jesus rose from the dead. The Bible says he did. And if we start from the assumption that everything the Bible says is true until we have rock hard, solid, irrefutable evidence that it isn't true, well, then I guess we just have to believe everything it says. And it says that Jesus rose from the dead, so I guess he did. Anyway, we'll talk more about that in some further detail in the next video when we look at chapter 9. That's the end of this video. That's the end of our look at this chapter. Thank you so much, as always, for joining me, for watching this, for paying attention to this, for finding some value in this. I truly appreciate it. As always, if you have something to say in response to something I have had to say in this video, please do leave a comment down below. Be you atheist, Christian, or some other stripe of believer or non-believer. I would be very interested in hearing your reaction, your response to what I have had to say. And as always, I would like to encourage all of you who enjoy these videos I do, both these Atheist Reads videos and the videos I do in general. If what I do here on this YouTube channel is of some value to you, please consider helping me to keep doing this by supporting my work through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of my channel for as little as $1 a month, and those $1 a month pledges help me out tremendously. Please don't feel like a $1 pledge isn't worth making, because it really is. They add up and they help me out. fantastically. And if you can pledge at a higher level, you can take advantage of some perks that I have worked into the Patreon campaign. For example, if you pledge at $5 a month or higher, one of the things you get is a sneak peek at new episodes of this series. You get a sneak peek at the scripts of the new Atheist Reads episodes, which I post to my patrons who pledge $5 or more the day before the video goes live. So you get a little preview, you get a script that you can follow along with if you watch or listen to the video. It's just something a little extra that I can offer for folks who go a bit above and beyond in supporting the Patreon campaign and allowing me to do what I do. So thank you all, as always, for watching. Those of you who are patrons, thank you so much for your patronage. Thanks to all of you for your support in whatever form it takes, and I will see you next time.